What if the founders never meant Hogwarts to be this way? What if the Hogwarts we know is already a failure? What if the four houses, the sorting hat, even the friendly rivalry baked into every feast are not traditions that worked, but emergency compromises from a plan that went catastrophically wrong? Today, we deconstruct a timeline where the founders never meant Hogwarts to be this way. We inherit the castle as a finished product. 4 banners, 4 tables, 4 virtues turned into personality tests. In the stories, that structure feels inevitable, almost natural, but reality in the wizarding world is rarely that neat. Imagine the psychological fracture at the very birth of the school if Gryffindor, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff were not designing a cozy boarding school at all, but a fortified engine of magic for a war that barely survives in the margins of canon. Picture this instead. Godric's sword, not mounted in a headmaster's office, but drawn in a torchlit hall, its blade dripping with basilisk venom that should not yet exist. Salazar's stone serpent, not a children's ghost story, but a living failsafe coiled beneath the foundations, waiting for a specific command. Rowena's diadem, not a vanity project, but a nocturnal beacon of strategy, glowing in the dark as she calculates troop movements and defensive wards. Helga's cup, not a sentimental heirloom, but a portable reservoir of food and healing charms, resting in a hidden kitchen designed to feed an army under siege. The question is brutal. What were these artifacts really for? The core issue is mechanical. You do not embed sentient staircases, shifting rooms, and an invisible boundary of ancient magic around a school unless you are thinking in terms of siege warfare and controlled access. You do not hide a basilisk in the plumbing unless you are planning for an enemy who might breach the walls. The Highlands location, the lake as a natural moat, the forbidden forest as a living buffer zone. Each choice reads less as whimsical world building and more as deliberate military architecture. So we ask the forbidden question: were the founders truly building a safe place for children to learn, or a weaponized fortress calibrated for a conflict that ended, changed shape, or was lost? If their real enemy was not muggles in general, but a specific magical faction, then the house system stops being a cute personality quiz and becomes a deployment grid. Courage at the front, cunning in the shadows, intellect in the watchtowers, loyalty in logistics, and care. And at the center of this machine sits a hat. The sorting hat presents itself as a friendly narrator, singing annual recaps about unity, division, and the noble dream of cooperation. But the subtext is brutal. This is a relic that contains 4 human minds, tasked with replicating an argument so ugly it tore the school apart, while never quite telling the full story. What was it ordered to omit? Which names, which spells, which betrayals were cut from the verses on purpose? The turning point arrives when we stop treating the hat as an objective historian and start treating it as a traumatized witness under magical compulsion. Its songs warn of danger, but never specify the original war. Its commentary on houses emphasizes harmony while preserving the very fractures that nearly destroyed the founders themselves. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated the moment we realize the entire system may be an automated continuation of a centuries-old disagreement. Because if the founders' design was flawed from the start, if the castle's dynamic, its loyalties, its rituals were calibrated for a crisis long gone, then every student who ever walked those corridors has been living inside someone else's mistake. Harry, Draco, Hermione, Snape, even you, imagining where you would be sorted. The divergence is finalized the moment we ask, what did the founders build? And what did it cost to keep that truth buried under songs and house points? The day Hogwarts was imagined, 4 adults, 1 dangerous idea. To answer that, we go back before the songs, before the banners, before the hat itself. We go to a single night in the Scottish Highlands, when Hogwarts is not yet a castle, but a dangerous idea passing between 4 exhausted adults. The land comes first. Wind scours the black rock, rain drags lines down the heather, and the mountains rise as if the earth has grown teeth. In the distance, the orange smear of a village fire. Not a hearth, a pyre. This is a Britain where witch burnings are not medieval color, but recent memory, where a muggle mob can erase a bloodline in an evening and call it justice. Imagine the psychological fracture already present when they meet. Godric Gryffindor arrives in armor scarred by curses, his sword not yet goblin-made, but already an argument in steel. He has pulled children out of cellars where they were hiding from their own parents, watched accidental magic explode into violence, and concluded that courage is not an innate trait, but a discipline. In his mind, fear is the enemy, and fear can be trained out of you. Salazar Slytherin stands a little apart, cloak dry under enchantments, eyes measuring exits and elevations. He has seen the same burnings, but his conclusion is colder. Exposure is failure, and failure begins with letting the wrong people in. Blood purity, for him, is not a slogan, it is a security protocol. Limit the variables, narrow the risk. His power is in control, and control demands exclusion. Rowena Ravenclaw watches the horizon rather than the flames. Her hands are ink-stained, her pockets full of sketches, floor plans, ward diagrams, early notes for a sorting hat that will one day hold fragments of their minds. She is obsessed with structure, with systems that can run when their bodies are gone. To her, chaos is a design flaw. The core issue is mechanical. If magic erupts randomly in terrified children, then you do not merely teach them. You architect a reality that channels that eruption. Helga Hufflepuff, by contrast, has the softest voice and the hardest line. She has fed refugees in barn lofts, hidden muggleborns in root cellars, and held the hands of parents who fear their own offspring. Helga insists, repeatedly, that every child deserves a chance before anyone decides what they are. Her loyalty is not sentimental, it is militant. She wants kitchens, common rooms, beds, a home, not a fortress. Now contrast this with the Dursley fantasy of normalcy we deconstruct in another timeline. Neat lawns, locked cupboards, and a desperate insistence that magic is abnormal. Here, Muggles are not comic suburban bigots. They are terrified, armed, and sometimes justified, because untrained warlocks have leveled hamlets. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated by raw, uncontrolled power on both sides. Around that Highland fire, the turning point arrives. They agree on the diagnosis. Scattered magical children are dying or turning dangerous, but not on the cure. Salazar sketches ramparts and restricted gates, a fortress and a filter. Godric imagines banners visible for miles, a beacon that calls the frightened and defies the hunters. Rowena speaks of a living library, corridors that remember, staircases that test, a castle that thinks. Helga answers with kitchens staffed by house elves, hospital wings, Hufflepuff cellars full of food, and spare blankets. The subtext is brutal. Before a single stone is laid, the fracture is there. Is this place a weapon, a sanctuary, a machine, or a family? They will compromise on geometry, on enchantments, on where to hide the more questionable chambers. But the divergence is finalized in their private definitions of what a child needs to survive. When we later watch the Sorting Hat dither over Harry or Draco or Hermione, we are not just seeing personality categories, we are watching 4 incompatible survival plans argue over one terrified 11-year-old. In that Highland storm, the houses begin as competing answers to a single, lethal question. How do you raise children in a world that wants them dead, or wants to use them? And buried in that first argument is the next secret we have to unearth. What did they hide in the walls to make sure their answer won? When the plans split, the first sorting and the birth of the houses. So we cut back into that chamber in the Highlands, not with grand banners or cheering tables, but with one child, one name, one decision that refuses to be made. The rain hammers the enchanted windows, torches gutter. A single first year stands in the center of a half-built great hall that feels less like a school and more like a courtroom. 4 founders sit in judgment, and the air carries the weight of a trial rather than a welcome feast. The child is Muggle-born, thin, shaking, robes a little too big. Their presence detonates every unresolved fear in the room. Where do they belong? What does belonging even mean when the outside world wants their kind erased? We slow the frame. Godric Gryffindor leans forward first. He sees the way the child's hands tremble, yet refuse to uncurl. The way they meet his gaze for half a second before flinching. To him, that half second is everything. Potential bravery. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand there anyway. In his internal reality, the core issue is mechanical. You build a future by training those who will charge the dragon, not those who will calculate the odds and walk away. Salazar Slytherin does calculate the odds. His eyes track the child's features, cataloging lineage he cannot verify, vulnerabilities he can. He remembers torches and pitchforks, the particular sound of a mob when they realize one of their own has turned. To Salazar, this child is not a blank slate. They are a walking breach in the walls, a future traitor under pressure. The subtext is brutal. He does not trust anyone whose blood can be used against them. Rowena Ravenclaw sees none of that first. She sees the way the child's pupils dilate at the sight of the floating candles, the quick, hungry attention as spells crackle at the edges of the founder's tempers. Raw, unshaped intellect, a mind reaching for patterns even while drowning in fear. For her, the psychological question is simple. Do you waste that potential because the world is cruel, or do you weaponize it against the world's cruelty? Helga Hufflepuff sees a scared child. Full stop. She notes the bitten nails, the stitched cuff, the way they keep glancing toward the doors, as if an angry parent might burst through at any moment. To Helga, the divergence is finalized the moment the others start debating categories instead of safety. You do not build a house before you build a home. The argument ignites. Salazar accuses the others of naivety, of inviting future Judas figures into their sanctuary. He speaks in the language of siege warfare and bloodlines, insisting that one weak link can collapse an entire defensive structure. Godric fires back that Salazar is becoming the persecutor they are hiding from, that he is importing the mob's logic into their supposed refuge. Rowena, usually measured, snaps that both of them are drowning in emotion, that fear and pride are no basis for policy. Helga is horrified that a child's fate is being decided by trauma rather than loyalty to the child in front of them. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated in that instant. This is no longer a school opening. This is a custody battle over the future. The turning point arrives when the child starts to cry. Silence. 4 adults, all veterans of war, undone by one 11-year-old's tears. Godric is the first to move. He pulls off his own battered hat, the one that has seen duels and dragonfire, and sets it on the nearest table. If we cannot agree, he says, let something impartial decide. Rowena's mind goes immediately to method, a mind-binding enchantment, a lattice of legitimacy and decision logic that can read a child's tendencies faster than any argument. The core issue is mechanical again. You encode a process so the timeline can continue without them. Helga intervenes. If they do this, the hat must carry all 4 perspectives. It cannot be a weapon for one philosophy. It must be a conversation preserved in fabric and spellwork. Salazar agrees, but only with a razor-edged condition. His criteria must be preserved forever, unedited by future sentimentality. His fear will be immortal. They draw their wands. Ancient words, older than the castle stones, twist through the air. Their minds pour into the hat courage, suspicion, curiosity, compassion, 4 clashing survival plans condensed into one enchanted object. For a moment, the hat is not a tool, but a mirror turned back on its makers. It knows them better than they know themselves, and in that brief, overloaded second, it sees something in their shared future, something it will never sing about, something still breathing in the walls when Harry Potter arrives. Hogwarts as a weapon, why the castle is where it is, and what it hides. The hat sees something breathing in the walls, so we pull the camera back and finally look at the walls themselves. Why here? Why a storm-lashed cliff in the Scottish Highlands, suspended above a black lake and ringed by a forest that actively wants you dead? Because Hogwarts is not a scenic boarding school. It is a fortress disguised as an education. Remote means hard to reach. Hard to reach means easy to defend, and easy to defend means you can layer impossible magic over an already hostile reality. The geography does half the work. Sheer drops, narrow approaches, brutal winters. Onto that, the founders stack unplottability, muggle-repelling charms that weaponize confusion and boredom, and wards that turn reconnaissance into hallucination. A muggle general would see fog, rock, and a migraine. A dark wizard would see a problem in 3 dimensions. Here, the core issue is mechanical. Each founder imprints their paranoia and hope directly into the stone. Salazar goes down, not up. Hidden passages, underwater tunnels, and of course the Chamber of Secrets, but also lesser-known crawl spaces and dead-end corridors that are only dead ends if you lack his passwords. His contribution is the principle that true power survives by vanishing underground. Rowena moves laterally. She designs the shifting staircases as a logic puzzle with teeth, a constantly reconfiguring maze that rewards pattern recognition and punishes mindless routine. Rooms respond to passwords, riddles, and intent. The castle becomes a test of cognition. For her, the layout is curriculum. If you cannot navigate the structure, you are not ready to wield its magic. Helga, in contrast, builds for survival in the mundane sense: warmth, food, and accessibility. She knits the kitchens directly directly beneath the Great Hall, enchants ovens for endless feasts, and softens corridors with light and heat that quietly resist the Highland cold. Secret entrances to the Hufflepuff common room sit low and close to the kitchens, a quiet thesis. Loyalty is maintained through comfort as much as through ideology. Godric looks up. Towers, battlements, open courtyards that double as training grounds. His mark is in the sightlines, and how archers, or later wand bearers, could hold a bridge or staircase against a numerically superior force. Where Salazar hides and Rowena calculates, Godric declares, "If war comes, we stand here." Taken together, Hogwarts becomes a living spell. The Great Hall is not just a cafeteria, it is a ritual nexus where enchanted ceiling, 4 house tables, and Helga's food magic synchronize the entire student body into one breathing organism. The lake and the forbidden forest function as wild reservoirs, external organs pumping untamed magic into the wards. The 4 common rooms anchor emotion, courage in the tower, ambition in the depths, intellect in the air, loyalty near the hearth. Then the turning point arrives, not in a duel, but in architecture. Somewhere in the Founder's era, a wing is sealed. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it is a corridor of prototype enchantments and failed experiments, including an early room of requirement that does not merely answer need, it answers fear. Imagine a chamber that materializes not what you consciously want, but what your subconscious dreads you will ask for. Pattern interrupt. What if the most dangerous secret at Hogwarts isn't the basilisk, the diadem, or the locket, but a room that once mirrored Helga's terror of famine, Rowena's horror of ignorance, Godric's fear of cowardice, and Salazar's fixation on impurity? That room would be unteachable, so they bury it. The subtext is brutal. Every moving staircase, every vanishing room, is not random whimsy, but a centuries-old argument fossilized in stone. A debate about protection, power, and who deserves either. Students walk through that argument every day, their claim to normalcy structurally annihilated by corridors that remember a war plan they will never be told. And in the next phase of this timeline, we deconstruct a timeline hidden beneath the official Hogwarts history, the moment that argument fractures beyond repair, and the divergence is finalized in one founder's decision to walk away. Godric Gryffindor, the idealist who built a battlefield school. So who is the man who decides to walk away from that argument and leave a sentient hat to keep fighting it for 1,000 years? Who is Godric Gryffindor when you strip away the heroic marketing and look at the battlefield record? The answer is that Hogwarts' patron saint of bravery is, first, a veteran of a lost war. Picture Godric not as a roaring lion in a common room portrait, but as a commander on a field where children are already casualties. He grows up in a Britain where dark wizards do not respect age limits, where magical conscription is informal but very real, and where the easiest soldiers to shape are frightened teenagers desperate for protection. He watches young witches pressed into service as lookouts, errand runners, eventually duelists. The psychological fracture that defines him is simple. He has seen what happens when children are only shields and never swords. So when the founders begin to design a school, Godric is not merely advocating bravery as a virtue. He is solving a military problem. The core issue is mechanical. If the world will weaponize magical children anyway, then Hogwarts must become the place where they learn to wield that weapon with loyalty and conscience, rather than terror and obedience. That logic bleeds into the stone. The open dueling culture, that later looks theatrical in Harry's era, begins as a controlled laboratory for fear. Corridors are wide enough for spell trajectories. Classrooms double as training halls. Even the placement of Gryffindor Tower is an argument. High, exposed, a beacon on the skyline that says, "We are not hiding." Symbolically, it reaches for the sky. Tactically, it dares enemies to come from any angle. Godric is building a school that is also a challenge. His personal relic makes the philosophy explicit. The sword of Gryffindor is goblin-forged, pure silver, enchanted so that it absorbs what strengthens it. Basilisk venom, magical compounds, ambient power from lethal encounters. The turning point arrives when you realize this is not just a weapon, it is a thesis statement. To Godric, danger is not an aberration in reality, it is the curriculum. You face the serpent, you survive, and the very poison that could kill you becomes part of your arsenal. But the subtext is brutal. If your house is built on glorifying courage, you risk sanctifying recklessness. A Gryffindor who backs down is not merely cautious, they are failing the founder's ghost. House pride becomes pressure, then doctrine. In the escalating rivalry with Salazar, every Slytherin argument for caution, secrecy, or bloodline control pushes Godric further toward public defiance, courage over calculation, confrontation over containment. Their personal feud hardens into architecture. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated by a staircase that rewards boldness and a tower that punishes hesitation. By Harry's era, we deconstruct a timeline in which that trauma has fossilized into expectation. First years enter a house where the password system, the portraits, even the common room stories assume that stepping into danger is not an exception but a rite of passage. Is this noble inheritance a culture that produces the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army, or is it a centuries-old trauma pattern encoded by a war veteran who could not imagine safety without readiness that keeps placing children between the castle and the curse? In the next phase of this history, we have to ask what happens when someone builds the opposite house. When Helga Hufflepuff responds to Godric's battlefield school with a sanctuary that quietly refuses his terms of engagement. Salazar Slytherin, paranoid visionary, or misunderstood villain. If Godric builds a school that feels like a forward operating base, what does his opposite number construct in response? What happens when a man walks the same battlefields and concludes that the danger is not out there in the forest, but already coded into the bloodlines walking his corridors? Enter Salazar Slytherin, and we have to deconstruct a timeline that canon flattens into a single adjective: prejudiced. The songs tell us he obsessed over pureblood students and then stormed away in a huff. That is the children's version. The adult version starts earlier, in burned villages and hanging trees, in Muggle reprisals against witchcraft, and in rogue magical families who sold out their own to survive. Salazar is not theorizing in a vacuum. He is auditing a century of persecution and betrayal, reading it as hard data. The core issue is mechanical. In his view, Hogwarts is not primarily a school, it is a containment structure, a fortress in the Highlands, wrapped in ancient magic, deliberately distant from Muggle power centers, designed to concentrate what he calls the most reliable bloodlines in one defensible location. He does not hate every Muggle-born equally. He fears that mixed loyalties, untested families, and untraceable kin networks will fracture the secrecy compact the moment the next witch hunt scales up from pitchforks to organized armies. Picture the argument in the Great Hall after midnight, candles guttering, maps and genealogies spread across the staff table. Godric insists that courage is a choice, that anyone can step forward when it counts, that giving power to the marginalized is how you build real loyalty. Salazar answers that bloodline is data, centuries of recorded oaths, patterns of silence under torture, families who did or did not hand their children to the pyre. For him, this is not bigotry, it is actuarial magic. The subtext is brutal. Godric is willing to risk leaks for the sake of moral principle. Salazar is willing to sacrifice fairness for the probability of survival. The turning point arrives when they stop arguing about admissions and start arguing about contingency. Godric believes the castle itself, with its shifting staircases and defensive enchantments, is the plan. Salazar starts carving his own plan into the bedrock. The Chamber of Secrets, in this reading, is not a melodramatic monster closet. It is a shadow campus, a hidden training ground, reachable only by those who speak his language, an escape artery that could move a blood-selected cadre beneath the siege lines, and in extremis, a last resort weapon. The basilisk is guardian, deterrent, and proof of concept. If you cannot control your fear in the dark, you do not belong in his inner ring. So when the divergence is finalized and he leaves, what does that departure actually mean? Does a strategist who has spent decades encoding contingencies simply walk out in theatrical outrage? Or does he do what he has always done, embed one more layer of delayed magic into the castle's nervous system? The chamber is only the visible symptom. He could have sealed a library whose shelves open only for a specific surname sequence, or woven a castle-wide spell keyed to the convergence of certain bloodlines, waiting for a threshold of betrayal that has not yet been reached in Harry's era. If that failsafe ever triggers, the house system we think we understand might not just be tested, it might be revealed as the first move in an unfinished war Salazar believed was inevitable. Rowena Ravenclaw, the architect of memory and the diadem's dangerous promise. If Salazar builds for conflict, Rowena builds for cognition. Where he weaponizes blood, she weaponizes thought, treating knowledge, memory, and logic not as abstract virtues, but as raw materials that can be engineered, stored, and amplified through magic. Rowena Ravenclaw is not simply the smart one, she is Hogwarts' systems architect, the mind that looks at a castle and sees an enormous thinking engine. The core issue is mechanical. How do you turn a building into a curriculum, a staircase into a syllabus, a door into a living exam that updates itself for centuries after you are gone? Her answer is brutal in its elegance. You enchant patterns, not people. Start with the diadem. An object that enhances the wisdom of the wearer sounds flattering, almost indulgent, until you examine the subtext. Why would the most brilliant witch of her age need an amplifier for the very trait that defines her? The subtext is brutal. Somewhere beneath the legend of effortless genius is a woman who does not trust her own mind to be enough, who designs a circlet that can overclock cognition the way Salazar overclocks blood purity. In that sense, the diadem is not just a trophy of intellect, it is a confession of insecurity. We deconstruct a timeline where Rowena's philosophy bleeds into the castle's moving parts. The ever-changing staircases are not whimsical chaos, they are a behavioral algorithm responding to patterns of movement, testing whether students learn to predict, adapt, or simply memorize routes. The Ravenclaw common room's riddle door is not a quirky personality trait, it is an eternal oral exam, an enchanted gate that refuses entry to those who have stopped thinking. Even the library's restricted section is a curated, ethically gated archive, the closest Hogwarts gets to an admission that knowledge without context is a form of structural violence. Then the turning point arrives. If you can store values in a hat, what stops you from storing a person? Canon tells us the founders pour their minds and priorities into the sorting hat as a temporary solution. That word is doing a lot of work. Rowena, who has already proven she can bind abstract qualities to physical objects, almost certainly pushes further, sketching a lost ritual designed to preserve the founder's consciousness beyond death. The hat becomes the partial, safer version, a composite intelligence, constrained to one function, so the ethical catastrophe of full immortality by enchantment is never fully realized. Pattern interrupt, jump centuries forward. Hermione Granger, 3rd year, arms full of ancient runes texts, hurries past an unremarkable stretch of stone on the 5th floor. She does not notice the hairline crack that is not a crack, the door that is not a door, leading to a sealed Ravenclaw experiment, a study chamber where time moves at a different rate, where an hour of revision could equal a week. Reality bends there, quietly, in service of exams. Rowena noticed the danger, she hid it, because once you start turning your own mind into a weapon, once you start stretching time and binding thought, the divergence is finalized. You are no longer just educating children, you are rewriting what human cognition is allowed to be inside these walls. And somewhere beneath the tower, another founder is watching all of this and making a very different calculation about survival. Helga Hufflepuff, the quiet strategist who saved Hogwarts. Helga Hufflepuff watches towers rise and tempers sharpen. While Godric and Salazar argue about who is worthy of power, she makes a decision that looks gentle and is anything but. If they will only take the brave and the cunning and the brilliant, what happens to everyone else? Her answer fractures the emerging hierarchy before it can harden. She will take the rest. This is usually read as softness, as if Helga volunteers to run the lost property bin of magical Britain. But the core issue is mechanical. In a school that is about to be structurally divided into ideological factions, she creates a pressure valve, a house that is not built on exclusion, but on absorption. When you deconstruct a timeline where Slytherin radicalizes purebloods, Gryffindor glorifies martyrdom, and Ravenclaw rewards disembodied intellect, Hufflepuff becomes the stabilizing middle, the place where the children who do not fit the extremes quietly accumulate, compare notes, and refuse to break. Helga understands something the others miss. Fear is a logistics problem as much as a moral one. Hungry children are easy to terrify and easier to weaponize, so she binds her name to the kitchens, the feasts that appear as if from nowhere, the platters that refill the moment they empty, the cocoa that shows up in the common room after a Dementor attack centuries later. This is her defensive spell, routine, warmth. The message that, no matter what horror is stalking the forbidden forest, dinner will be on the table at 6. The subtext is brutal. While the others are inscribing their faces into relics, Helga is inscribing safety into muscle memory. You come back from a cursed corridor, you wash your hands, you eat. You are reminded 3 times a day that you belong to a functioning structure. That predictability makes it harder for extremist voices to convince frightened 11-year-olds that the world is ending and only blood purity or glorious sacrifice can save them. Then there are the house elves. On paper, Helga's solution looks fair. Rather than human servants bound by coin and coercion, Hogwarts will be run by beings whose magic is naturally domestic, whose loyalty, once given, is almost impossible to fracture. She creates the great underground kitchens, tethers elf magic to the castle's bones, and in doing so ensures that, even under a hostile headmaster, the castle still cleans itself, feeds itself, and hides those who need hiding. This is not uncomplicated. Binding generations of elves to a school is an ethical wound the narrative never fully probes, but in wartime, that hidden workforce becomes an invisible backbone. Death Eaters can seize classrooms, yet they cannot easily seize the kitchens they barely acknowledge exist. Her values crystallize into architecture. The Hufflepuff common room is low and earthy, near the kitchens, round doors, and plant-lined tunnels rather than soaring spires. It trains students to see comfort as communal, not individual. You learn that hard work is not about heroics, but maintenance. Tending herbs, mending friendships, showing up. Under pressure, those are the traits that keep a community from shattering into self-preserving fragments. So while Godric is stockpiling swords and Salazar is stockpiling secrets, Helga is stockpiling habits. When the turning point arrives, when founders feud, when corridors echo with arguments about blood and brilliance, her systems do not take sides. They keep running. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated. Breakfast still appears. That is her quiet thesis about survival. Walls can fall, relics can be stolen, but a culture of loyalty and shared routine is harder to kill. And if you follow that culture forward, past the founders' own lifetimes, you begin to see who really inherits it, and what happens when their descendants weaponize belonging in a very different way. The argument that broke Hogwarts. How the split really happened. If Helga's breakfast table is the thesis, then the argument that breaks Hogwarts is the footnote no one wants to read. Because what if the houses we know are not the plan, but the scar tissue? We deconstruct a timeline in which the famous row between Godric and Salazar is not a single explosion in the Great Hall. It is sedimentary, years of silted resentment, thin layers of small betrayals hardening into stone. A Muggle-born girl admitted on Godric's personal recommendation, a half-blood boy quietly expelled at Salazar's insistence after a werewolf scare near the Forbidden Forest. Rowena and Helga smoothing it over, rewriting minutes, assuring both men that the structure still holds. The core issue is mechanical. Every September, the Sorting Hat sits on the staff table, a patched relic that is also a recording device. 4 minds poured into one object, forced to arbitrate a conflict its creators refuse to resolve. At first, sorting is effortless. The values align, the categories feel generous. But as the founder's dynamic decays, each new sorting becomes a negotiation. The hat feels the tug of war in its brim, Godric whispering courage, Salazar hissing caution, Helga insisting on second chances, Rowena murmuring patterns and probabilities. Watch the psychological strain increase. A Muggle-born with a talent for parseltongue arrives. The hat hesitates so long, the hall begins to murmur. A pure-blood boy who fears the dark begs not to be Slytherin. The hat nearly splits its seam, torn between Salazar's doctrine and Godric's growing defiance. The subtext is brutal. Every child becomes a proxy battle. Every decision a referendum on whose vision will win. The turning point arrives with one girl, half-blood on parchment, Muggle raised in reality, bearing an old Highland name that appears in both Slytherin's and Gryffindor's family trees. Godric sees a political bridge, proof that blood does not dictate worth. Salazar sees a security breach, proof that bloodlines are already contaminated. Rowena runs the numbers and warns that public scandal will destabilize the school's reputation. Helga quietly seats the girl near the Hufflepuff table at dinner, testing how the room reacts. When the hat touches her head, the fracture becomes audible. Inside the brim, 4 founders argue through their echoes. Godric pushes Gryffindor, Salazar demands Slytherin, Helga offers refuge, Rowena proposes a radical option: do not sort her at all, declare a 5th path. In that instant, the hat understands the constraint of its own enchantment. There are only 4 houses. The divergence is finalized when Salazar, in open session, forbids the girl's admission entirely. Godric refuses. To back down would betray every student he has already defended. Salazar walks, convinced that staying would betray the school's safety. Rowena watches her elegant system weaponized into a purity test. Helga feels her dream of a unified home fracture along a line she cannot mend with food or kindness. When the dust settles, the founders are dead or gone, but the hat remains. It still carries their minds, their trauma, their loyalties, and in the quiet decades that follow, it begins to adjust. Perhaps it nudges ambitious bigots elsewhere. Perhaps it quietly gathers them. The next time it hesitates over a dark-haired orphan with a famous curse scar, the question is no longer which house he belongs to. The question is what the hat is really trying to prevent or preserve. Relics and lost spells, the founders' objects as a hidden system. If the hat is still negotiating their arguments, what else did the founders leave behind that is still running in the background? What if the real operating system of Hogwarts is not the houses at all, but 4 objects everyone misreads as trophies? We deconstruct a timeline where the relics stop being set dressing and become a circuit. Lay them out on a table. Godric's sword, goblin-made, presenting itself only to those who prove courage, absorbing that which makes it stronger. Rowena's diadem, an intelligence amplifier, whispering clarity into the mind that wears it. Helga's cup, an unassuming vessel tied to food, healing, and sustenance, perfectly in line with the witch who enchanted the very kitchens. Salazar's locket, a channel for serpentine speech and bloodline pride, a private conduit for the founder most obsessed with lineage and defense. On the surface, these are personal heirlooms, expressions of ego, but the core issue is mechanical. Courage, wisdom, loyalty and sustenance, lineage and protection. This is not a random assortment of powers. This is a ritual schema. Sword, diadem, cup, locket, fire, air, earth, water. Will, intellect, body, heritage. Brought together, they do not simply sit, they balance. Imagine a hidden protocol. Once a decade, perhaps once a generation, the 4 artifacts are gathered in a specific chamber, each placed on an engraved sigil reflecting its house. The sword tests the heart of the caster. The diadem stabilizes their judgment. The cup binds the spell to the community's ongoing survival. The locket ties the entire structure to the tangled web of magical bloodlines that actually attend the school. The castle's wards, the moving staircases, the sentient portraits. Everything is quietly rebooted. What is being evaluated in that ritual? A future headmaster's fitness? The continued health of the house dynamic? Or something more drastic? A failsafe to collapse or reset the house system itself if the psychological fracture between them grows too extreme? The subtext is brutal. The founders did not trust their descendants. They built a kill switch for their own design. Now place Voldemort into that architecture. He takes the diadem, the cup, the locket, and, indirectly, the sword, and uses them not as nodes in a unity network, but as containers for a shattered soul. A system meant to circulate balanced virtues becomes a map of his corruption. The divergence is finalized the moment he inserts his trauma into the grid. Instead of courage, the sword becomes a test of whether you are willing to destroy a piece of him. Instead of wisdom, the diadem becomes a parasite. Instead of loyalty, the cup hoards life for one. Instead of lineage, the locket weaponizes ancestry into despair. Pattern interrupt, reverse the quest. Imagine a timeline where Dumbledore discovers the founder's original design before he discovers Horcruxes. Harry, Hermione, and Ron are not hunting fragments of Voldemort. They are racing to reclaim the 4 relics before the network collapses completely. The mission is not to kill a man, but to reboot a school. In that version of reality, the turning point arrives not in the Forbidden Forest, but in the chamber where sword, diadem, cup, and locket finally touch, and Hogwarts decides what it wants to be next. Secret rooms, bloodlines, and the Founder's invisible hand in Harry's era. In that chamber, where relic meets relic and the network reboots, Hogwarts is not just a backdrop, it is a character finishing a sentence that began 1,000 years earlier. To understand that decision, we have to walk backwards through the walls themselves. Start with the obvious fracture. The Chamber of Secrets is Salazar Slytherin's private footnote in the Foundations, a physical manifestation of his refusal to compromise. He builds a room only his blood and his language can open, hides a basilisk as an ethnic cleansing mechanism, and hard-codes paranoia into the plumbing. When the chamber reopens in Harry's timeline, the subtext is brutal. Slytherin is still arguing with the other three, and he is using children as punctuation. Now pivot upward, to a room that pretends to have no fixed position at all. The Room of Requirement, appearing precisely when needed, reads less as random miracle and more as the final phase of a Ravenclaw experiment in adaptive architecture. Rowena is the mind who pours intelligence into stone. Of course, her wing of the castle would learn to listen, to scan for psychological need, and generate the exact configuration required. When it shelters Dumbledore's army, what we deconstruct a timeline to see is a Rowena-authored algorithm choosing to host civil disobedience. Helga's work runs underfoot. The enchanted kitchens that mirror the Great Hall, the Hufflepuff common room tucked beside them, low and warm and round, are not accidents of interior design. They are a defensive perimeter disguised as hospitality. In the Battle of Hogwarts, that perimeter flips. House elves surge out of Helga's kitchens with knives and frying pans. Hufflepuffs refuse evacuation, and the Great Hall becomes both sanctuary and front line. Her table magic inverts into trench warfare. The core issue is mechanical. She built a system where those who serve the food can also choose when the feast ends. Godric's legacy is less about corridors and more about edges. The Forbidden Forest's boundary, the grounds used for dueling practice, and flying lessons all sit inside a Gryffindor thesis that courage must be trained against real danger. When Harry walks into that forest to die, he is tracing Godric's intended route, from castle to treeline to moral decision. Beneath all of this runs a quieter speculation: founder bloodlines. The Gaunts flaunt their link to Slytherin, but what about the diluted threads no one boasts about? If Hogwarts is saturated with founder magic, it is plausible that certain surnames, ancient purebloods, obscure half-bloods, even a muggle born with an inexplicable knack, trigger dormant permissions. Doors that swing open for one student and not another. Staircases that move late for some, but not for others. A sword that presents itself only to a Gryffindor in extremis. These are not random quirks. They are the castle-running ancestry and ethos checks in real time. By Harry's era, Hogwarts appears to choose sides. The Room of Requirement manifests for the DA, not for Umbridge. The Sword of Gryffindor arrives for Harry in the forest, and for Neville in the flames, as if Godric's enchantment is less about blood purity and more about demonstrated loyalty under pressure. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated. This is not an impartial school, it is a four-way argument still echoing through stone, which raises an uncomfortable question as we leave this section. If these are only the rooms we have seen, what Founder-era spaces are still closed, waiting for the wrong heir or the right catastrophe before they finally unlock and finalize the divergence of Hogwarts forever? If the Founders could see Hogwarts now, would they be proud or horrified? So imagine this. The answer to that question is not in a textbook, but in a trial. The Founders return as a ghostly council, summoned not by necromancy, but by the castle itself, to watch what their experiment became. The Great Hall is dark, no students, no banners, only 4 translucent figures and a series of suspended memories. Voldemort's resurrection, the basilisk sliding through pipes, the goblet flaring blue-white, the Battle of Hogwarts tearing stone apart. What if Hogwarts could force its makers to witness their legacy in motion? What if the Sorting Hat's private archive of 1,000 years were suddenly projected as evidence? Today, we deconstruct a timeline where the judges are the architects. Godric watches first, Harry facing the troll, the basilisk, the dragon, the Death Eaters. His expression is complex. On one level, this is everything he believed in. Courage not as bravado, but as the willingness to stand in front of death for others. Yet the subtext is brutal. Again and again, it is children in the corridor while adults debate in offices. The core issue is mechanical. A system built to cultivate bravery has no emergency brake. It keeps producing heroes instead of protections. Godric would be proud of Harry's power and horrified by the institutional failure that required it. His ideal of noble risk has been gamified into house points, Quidditch injuries, and a Triwizard tournament that casually spits a 14-year-old into a graveyard. Then, the turning point arrives. Tom Riddle, on the screen of memory, half-blood, brilliant, speaking Parseltongue in Godric's own castle. Salazar's gaze sharpens. Here is vindication and indictment in one body. A half-blood nearly destroys the school through secret chambers and weaponized ancestry. Salazar can claim, with icy precision, that his fears were not irrational, yet he also sees Slytherin banners behind every bully, every Death Eater recruitment, every teacher who assumes that green and silver mean future criminal. His house has become a stereotype factory, not the cadre of disciplined, strategic defenders he imagined. The divergence is finalized when he sees Snape die for a cause he can never publicly claim, loyalty and cunning twisted, then redeemed in silence. Rowena is quieter. She tracks the evolution of magic itself. Arithmancy advances, new branches of charms. Muggleborn's decoding theory with terrifying speed. Intellect has expanded, but watch her face during the sorting scenes. Year after year, 11-year-olds are told who they are in one word, and then the castle reorganizes reality around that verdict. Her temporary algorithm, poured into the hat as a stopgap, has ossified into a social caste structure. Cross-house collaboration exists only in crisis, never by design. Her sorting logic has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Brave children do brave things because they are trained to. Ambitious children hoard power because everyone expects it. Helga feels it in the small moments. Draco calling Hermione mudblood. Fred and George weaponizing pranks against first years. Seamus doubting Harry because his house's gossip network says so. She also sees the counterspell, Neville helping a fallen classmate in the rubble, Hufflepuffs forming a shield wall during the battle, students sneaking food to ostracized peers. Her enchantments in the kitchen still feed everyone. Her ethos still flickers in every ordinary kindness that keeps a traumatized child from breaking. But her eyes are wet. This is not the inclusive refuge she built under the Highlands. So the question rebounds, now aimed at us. If the founders could vote, would they dismantle the houses or repair them? Is the house system still worth the fractures it creates, or has their claim to normalcy been so structurally annihilated that Hogwarts needs a new magic of belonging entirely? And if that vote were held today, who would actually get a say? 4 ghosts, or the children still bleeding in the corridors of their arguments? Rewriting Hogwarts. What you'd change about the founders' legacy. So what do we do with a school built on an argument that never ended? What do we do with a castle that is both sanctuary and weapon, both promise and threat? The answer is uncomfortable. We start by admitting that Hogwarts itself is a living spell cast by 4 traumatized visionaries, and that we are still walking through the blast radius. Across this episode, we deconstruct a timeline that begins with fear, Godric, Salazar, Rowena, Helga, not archetypes, but human beings who had seen children burned, hunted, erased. They poured that terror and loyalty into stone. The moving staircases, the shifting corridors, the sentient portraits are not whimsical decor. They are a defense grid, a paranoid architecture designed to confuse invaders and shelter the young, even if it means confusing the young as well. The core issue is mechanical. The house system that promises belonging is also a sorting algorithm for risk. Gryffindor and Slytherin harden into opposing militias, Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff into parallel strategies of survival. Knowledge as shield, community as fortress. The artifacts and secret rooms, sword, diadem, cup, locket, chamber, room of requirement, form an unfinished network of power, a distributed spell the founders never fully debugged before history moved on without them. So the turning point arrives centuries later, and the subtext is brutal. The Hogwarts we inherit in Harry's era is not the pristine blueprint of 4 united geniuses. It is a distorted version of their dream, warped by their arguments, their fears, and compromises they assumed would be temporary. Salazar's solution becomes a buried basilisk. Rowena's diadem, meant to enhance wisdom, is corrupted into a Horcrux. Helga's kitchens, designed to feed every child, coexist with a house whose students are still mocked as leftovers. which raises the question directly to you. If you had to choose one founder as your personal mentor, whose office door are you knocking on? Do you stand with Godric's reckless courage, Salazar's ruthless realism, Rowena's haunted intellect, or Helga's stubborn, unfashionable care? And once you sit in that office, what is the one change you demand to their original design? Do you abolish houses entirely, merge them into two broad coalitions, or carve a fifth house out of the fractures the others refuse to heal? Imagine yourself in their place. The world is hostile, the information is incomplete, the children keep arriving. You have to build a structure of magic fast enough to keep them alive, knowing every choice might outlive you by 1,000 years. What mistakes do you make on purpose? Which prejudices do you hide in the walls, promising yourself you will come back and fix them when the war is over? In the next episode, we will follow one of those decisions and ask what happens if the divergence is finalized differently, if Salazar never leaves, or if Helga refuses to let the houses harden into bloodlines. Until then, rewrite Hogwarts in the comments. Redesign the houses, draft your founder mentor, rebuild the castle from the foundations up. And remember, somewhere in the attic, the Sorting Hat is still singing, still sorting, still carrying 4 very human, very flawed minds inside, waiting for someone to finally argue back.